Okay, and well, welcome. Welcome to West Court. Welcome to the West Court Lecture Theatre. Welcome to this talk. I've never given a talk in this lecture theatre before. You've never heard a talk in this lecture theatre before. And it's being live streamed. Boys, am I nervous. So, first of all, introductions. My name is Ian Wilson. So I am the chemical engineering fellow in the college. At this point, you go, oh yeah, hold on. Where's he from? Okay, so I'm from Northern Ireland. Now, there's another guy called Ian in the college from Northern Ireland with a surname beginning with W who's an engineer. It's very simple. The white-haired guy is the master. The black-haired guy is the comical engineer. Okay, so this talk is about Marmite. Love it or hate it, okay? And this is it's a story which comes about because of some work we did for a PhD. And a student worked with me and one of my colleagues, and he is now Dr. Marmite. A very unique man. I'll tell you about him later on. Okay, so Marmite is made by Unilever, so everything here is done courtesy of Unilever allowing us to say it. And there's some bits I'm not allowed to say, so I won't be saying those. Okay, so moving on, what is Marmite? Well, the easy answer to that question is it's a spread. Okay, so it's a spread product. There's a typical application of Marmite. And what you notice here is not everybody agrees with this, okay? Also, Marmite is a wonderful vehicle for merchandising and marketing, and here we have some examples of Unilever's efforts in the field, and you feel free to have a look at them afterwards, okay? Not all of them are full, though. Some of them still haven't been opened yet. Anyway, so we have this dichotomy, okay? Some people like the stuff, and some people hate the stuff. Okay, some people like it a lot. So at this point, I think I need to do some audience sampling here. Okay, can, by show of hands, have indication of the lovers and the haters, okay? So you know what the questions are. This isn't a Brexit referendum, right? Okay, can I have lovers? And can I have unlovers? Excellent, excellent. I'm glad to see that we have a representative thing. Okay. So, having established which part of the gallery I'll be singing to, let's move on. Marmite, okay, it's a spread product. It's been around for a while. It's been around since 1902. It's made originally by a company which then became part of Best Foods, et cetera, et cetera. And these are some of the old Marmite packaging. You can see that the shape has stayed effectively the same. And partly because the name Marmite comes from the French word marmite. That's my best French. Marmite, for a little cooking pot. Okay, so that's a distinctive part, and that is effectively a trademark which is all branded, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been made at Burton and Trent since 1902, so people have been eating it for a long while. Now, there are other places in the world where it's made. Did you know that? There are other places in the world where it's eaten as well. And one of them, in particular, is this one. Okay? So just to reorientate yourselves, we are here. Okay? And this is New Zealand, okay? And in New Zealand, the company Sanitarium has been making Marmite under license since 1910, okay? And as you can see, the packaging is very different, okay? And what they do with it, I don't want to comment on, okay? But they're quite enthusiastic about it, okay? So that's New Zealand Marmite, and we'll get back to that later on, okay? So why is it made in Burton-on-Trent? Well, here we have a very special map of Great Britain, which is a master brewery map of Great Britain. And you can see that the purple circle is where Burton-on-Trent is. So Marmite, of course, is yeast extract. So it's brewer's yeast. So you need to get the yeast from somewhere, and breweries are ideally where you get them from. And so it's well placed logistically in terms of its raw material. Now, is anyone here from Burton-on-Trent? Anyone ever been to Burton-on-Trent? Okay, in which case you know why the Marmite factory is there, because two of the biggest breweries in the UK are in Burton-on-Trent. In fact, the Marmite factory is next door to the Bass, what was the Bass factory, and is now the Coors factory. So literally, they just ship the feedstock through a gate in the fence. And then the Marston one is across the town, et cetera. So this is where all the feedstock comes from. Okay, so that's why it's in Burton-on-Trent. Okay, and this is then a story about feedstocks. So that's the Latin name for brewer's yeast, okay? Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And this is all an example of sustainable manufacturing, because the feedstock for Marmite is the byproduct from beer manufacture. Some people would call it a waste product. I have to use the word byproduct, okay? Okay, and so what you do is you take these wonderful things, and as you can see, they're not terribly big, very cute little yeast cells. You put them through a thing that looks like this. Okay, in this case, this is a small brewery, okay? And from that, you get two products. You get that stuff, okay? And you get brewer's yeast. And I'm really interested in the brewer's yeast. I don't really care what happens to that stuff, okay? Unless it's this stuff. Oh, I'm just playing the crowd, okay. Okay, so, and actually, let's just have an aside. Marketing masterpiece. Does anyone remember when Guinness yeast Marmite was launched? Well, when was it launched? St. Patrick's Day. You know, Jesus students haven't changed that much. Okay, so, and that's it. Now, oh, hold on. Has anyone seen this? Where is it? This is the Jesus College microbrewery. And you can see it's a Jesus College microbrewery because it's far too clean to be working. I am a card-carrying, spanner-wielding chemical engineer, and I've never seen a brewery that clean. Okay? So, at one point, this will be making beer, and who knows? Vegemite might be on our way. Moving on, then. Yes, so process overview. How do you make Marmite? Okay, so this is very sort of packaged in very simple things. You take your brewer's yeast. What you have to do is you have to get the stuff out of the yeast cells. What we're interested in is the contents of the yeast cells, lots and lots of proteins and starches, and those provide all the vitamins and the things that are good for you. Because basically, Marmite is quite good for you, mostly. Okay. So what you have to do is you have to break up those cells. And you use a process called autolysis. And what you do is you put the cells, minus a lot of the water, and the alcohol has been stripped out as well, in a salt solution. And salt has a big effect on the osmotic pressure of water. So what it does, it just ruptures the cells. Okay, they just burst. And that releases all the contents, and the cells are then running like broken eggs sort of thing. So what you have to do is you have to do a bit of separation. Now, there are two stages to this separation. The first one is actually a filtration stage where you take out all the cell debris. That's the cell walls and the bits and pieces. Okay? And that gives you a solution, which is rich in all these things. You then have to do something else, which is to remove the compounds present in that solution, which are called bittering compounds. Because, of course, beer is quite bitter. Right? And Marmite is not bitter, really. So for those of you who have engaged with it, okay? And so there is a process in there called debittering. And what they do is remove these compounds which are present there. And that is proprietary to Unilever and Marmite, okay? And that's why it's quite hard to make Marmite at home, because you would have to go through this debittering stage. And for the lawyers present, I'm not talking about it. Right. So then what you do is you have a solution, which is debittered, and then you concentrate it up in a big evaporator. Okay, so you take a lot of the water out, and that, if you can imagine taking a sugar solution, take the water out, you end up with a very, very sticky fluid. Okay, a very, very dense syrup. Anyway, that's called de-extract. Then you store it for a while. Okay, you store it for a while, as long as you need. Then you blend it, because we'll get into the blending later on, just to give the product with the right characteristics. And actually what they do is they add some things to make it even better for you. Okay? So as a health enhancement. And then that product is called Marmite. So that's how you make Marmite. Okay? So all you need is some really secret technology. And a nearby brewery. Okay? Because, of course, what you're doing is you are saying to the brewers, you give us some money, and we'll take the yeast off your hands. Or you have to pay to landfill it. But because it's got alcohol in it, it actually costs quite a lot, right? So there's an interesting dynamic in this. And as long as the English keep drinking beer, there shall be Marmite. Okay, so for those of you who like beer, you could justify a moderate consumption on the basis of keeping a homegrown industry going. Okay, so then you get your different things, and you can get different products. You can get the squeegees, you can get all of these. Now, some of them do differ from others, and we'll get on to that in a moment. So the next question is, what is in Marmite? It is a lot of protein, 65 weight percent. It's high protein. For those of you who are paying shed loads of money for whey protein extract, Marmite is up there with you. Then you've got about a quarter of it is water and 10% salt. That's why Marmite is so salty. And the reason why it's so salty is you need the salt to lyse the cells in order to make the product in the first place. And the manufacturers, of course, have looked at replacing sodium chloride with other things, etc. And one day, they might be able to do something about that. And then you get flavorings. Now, the key thing is that there's a little bits of solids, these little fragments. These proteins are, a couple of thousand daltons in size, etc. You're not going to taste them because their size is always less than 5 microns. Most of them are less than 1 micron. Okay? And as a guideline, your tongue can detect things at between 10 and 20 microns. So you think of caster sugar, you think of icing sugar, and you think of granulated sugar. You can taste granulated sugar on your tongue. You can taste caster sugar, icing sugar. Right? That's because icing sugar is milled to a size below the detection limit for your tongue. And these fragments are all well below that. Okay, so that's what's in Marmite. So the first thing to note is it is salty. Right? It is saltier than that stuff. Okay, seawater is 3.5 weight percent salt. Okay, seawater has an osmotic pressure of 28, 30 atmospheres. What do you know about then the osmotic pressure of the liquid phase in Marmite? It's big, right? It's big. So that means you don't have to worry about these things. Okay, here we have some nice pink things. Okay, I'll give you a clue. That's about 1 or 2 microns in diameter. These are bacteria. These aren't very nice bacteria. These are salmonella. Okay? Now, the key thing is virtually all bacteria known to man cannot live in Marmite. That is the important thing. The osmotic shock it would get in getting in there would kill it automatically. Okay? So it's safe, right? It will keep for almost forever, right? Unless you start diluting the salt, which is why you have to keep the top on. Okay? Pardon? Osmotic is suction. Okay, so if you have a membrane and you have fresh water on one side and salt water on the other, the salty water gives rise to a suction, which sucks the water in. So that's why when you sit in the sea for a while, you start to look a bit like a prune. Okay? Those of you who sit in the sea for a while. Okay? All these sorts of things. So osmotic pressure is a measure of the suction power. Okay? Yeah. So, yeah, if anybody else needs some elucidation as we go along, do interject. Okay, so it's pretty safe. So you don't need to put it in the fridge. Okay, all you're doing is making it very cold. Right, but you knew that. So let's talk about the science. Underlying the science of Marmite is it's a shearing flow. Okay, so here we have a bit of robbery has gone on. Pre-toast. Okay, and what we do is we spread it. Everybody happy with that idea? So what we're doing is we're going to, now you see the thing is, in any of these talks, I'm always leave, should I open this or not? Because I know about 25% of the room will want to leave. Okay, so for those of you who want to do it afterwards, you can do it afterwards, but maybe not now. Otherwise, yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to take that and we're going to move the stuff across that surface. So there's our lump of Marmite, and chalk just doesn't do this. Okay? So what we've done is we have created a spread. We've made that liquid product move across. So the key thing here is, right, what's the mechanics of that? I'm an engineer. I'll be into the mechanics of that. So what we're interested in is the velocity. Okay? Some of you, I know, are just wanting to leave the room. Okay? Okay? You've got the velocity that the blade is moving across and the gap there. And this is today's equation. Okay? You're going to get an equation. It's the velocity divided by this gap size is called the shear rate. Okay? So let's think about this. What would the value of that be? I need a volunteer. Okay. Could you simulate a spreading of Marmite on your bread, please? Can you show the audience as well?
So I dig out of the doggins, and I seek to flatten it.
Excellent, excellent. Now, I'd like you to do that again, but I'd like someone to time him, how long he goes from there to there. Okay? Or shall I do it?
Okay, well, I reckon I've got to go twice.
Yeah, hold on. Right, off you go.
And then this side.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So George, this is George, took 3 seconds to spread his Marmite across a piece of bread. Now that piece of bread is about 0.1 meters long, because I measured it earlier. Okay, so that means 0.1 divided by 3 meters per second. Okay, and then what's the gap? How thick do you spread your Marmite? Oh, I know, we could be here all afternoon. Okay, everybody agree it's going to be less than a millimeter? Yeah, you're all still here, so that sounds like you do. Let's say it's 1/10 of a millimeter, okay? No? More? What about, no, I'm going to go for 1/10 because I can do the sums. Okay, so we have 0.1 divided by 1/10 of a meter, that's 10 to the minus 4, so that means we've got 1,000, okay? Divided by 3 seconds, that's about 300, okay? If you're going to have thicker, you're going up to 200, 100 reciprocal seconds. Okay, so the magic number is around 100. Everybody happy with that? And the units are reciprocal seconds. Right, right. Okay, so of course it varies with the customer. Right, so now we're into the science, okay? And this measure of spreadiness is viscosity. Okay, so as viscosity shows up in this equation, our shear force, that's how hard you have to move, or what force you have to put on the knife to get it through there, is equal to the viscosity times the shear rate. Now, we've just worked out the shear rate about 100, okay? So we got 2 old guys involved in this. The top one might be familiar to you. The bottom one, I'll be really impressed if you know who it is. The top one is Newton, okay? So Newton first coined this, and a Newtonian fluid is one where the viscosity is always the same. Okay, examples of Newtonian fluids are water, air, oil, things like that. Right, this guy. Any guesses? Pardon? Correct nationality? Correct first letter? Was I? Oh, it's so good, but it's still wrong. It's Pascal. Ah, okay. So the units of shear force are pascals. So you'll see pascals shooting up. Okay, anyway, so there we go. And what you do is you get a really expensive thing that basically does a shimmy experiment, okay? That's what you have is a plate, and you've got a sample underneath it and a big plate, and you move it back and forwards, and you measure how fast it goes, you measure what force you need, you measure what you had for breakfast, all these sorts of things. Okay, it was called, well, we'll get onto it later. Okay, so here is what's then called a flow curve. I've got a few of these curves, I'll explain them carefully, okay? Here is the shear rate, okay? That's how fast the thing is being sheared. Everybody happy with that? The faster you go, the bigger this number gets. And there's that magic number of about 100. Okay, the apparent viscosity, well, that's the spreadiness. Okay, how thick it is, how it wants to be sheared or not. So a high viscosity means it's pretty thick. The viscosity of water is 1 millipascal second, so it's about there. Okay, it's off the chart. Honey is about 10. So you can see it starts off, it's quite viscous, right? But what you see is as you spread it, it gets less viscous. And so we call this shear thinning. Note that this is actually a log axis, and this is a log axis. So that goes from 1 to 10 to 100, so that's big difference. 10 to 100 to 1,000, big difference. So it really gets thinner. And the reason for that is we're going from what was an unstructured liquid at the beginning, everything's distributed pretty randomly, and then it all sort of lines up and makes it easier to flow as you shear it. Okay? Now, this is the magic bit that comes along. What we've done here is increase the shear rate from there with time. So it's going up. So what I'm going to show you is what happens when you go back. Everybody happy with the idea? So it went quickly, and then I'm going to go slowly. So this is called a ramp, a shear ramp. It does that. It's completely Newtonian on the way back. The viscosity is constant, no matter what shear rate it is. Okay? So this is really, really strange. Okay? So basically, I think Marmite's basically Irish, right? It remembers what you've done to it. We'll come back to that. Now, that is really unusual. Okay. So, now it does it whatever way you do it. So this is another one of these charts. What I've done is I've started with a high shear stress, gone to a low value back again, and you can see, oh, it's still doing this thing. And that's what we had beforehand. It's there. So it remembers. Its structure changes, and then it remembers it. So that means when you start spreading, suddenly it stays easy to spread. Is that familiar with those of you who practice this art? You get it out, and because it's quite gloopy, it doesn't fall off a knife. And then as you start to spread, it becomes wonderfully easy to spread. Sorry, that sounded like I'm endorsing the product. Anyway, moving on. So, is Marmite Newtonian? The answer is no. So sorry, Isaac, we're not going to talk about you anymore. This introduces us to a topic of science called rheology. Okay, rheology. Now, your spell checker will change it to theology. Okay? And this is the speaker after us, okay? This is Janet Soskice. She is a theologian, okay? We're not talking about theology. Sorry, Janet, we're talking about rheology. And people who practice rheology are called rheologists. Okay, as opposed to theologians. Subtlety, subtlety. You may as well learn something while you're here. Okay, and there are some really funny words in here. There's how you spell rheology. You see why they think you've got it wrong. Okay, and you can have things which are rheopectic, viscoplastic, viscoelastic, okay, thixotropic. All these words. And effectively, Marmite has shades of viscoplasticity with a good gloop of thixotropy. That's all you need to know if you want to really bemuse your neighbors. Okay. So you can measure this in different ways. One of the ways is to find out, well, just how solid is it? So you can imagine taking a rubber band. Does anyone know what the type of material a rubber band is? It's elastic. Yeah, so we'll call it elastic. Right? And so you can measure how elastic it is. And this chart I'm going to show you is its elasticity. So you got these G's. Okay, G's means good. Okay, and you've got one with 1' and one with 2'. Now, G' is the elastic modulus, and G double prime is the viscous modulus. These tests allow you to tell how elastic it is compared to how viscous it is. You know, I've got a shade of elasticity day, or whatever. So if it's very elastic, it's like a rubber band. If it's very viscous, it's like honey. Okay, and the easy way to remember it is that's got one little bit, and elastic has one S. And this has got two little bits, and viscous has got two S's. And believe me, this is very helpful for chemical engineers, right? For them to remember these things for years to come. But what you can see is initially at very low strains, when it's on your knife, and you're not really moving it very much, it's elastic. Okay, that's almost a factor of 10 bigger. Then you get to a certain point, and it becomes viscous. So it has a transition from being elastic to being viscous. And you need a stress of about 1 Pascal to switch over between those. Okay, so that's why it works so well. Yeah. Now, the reason why it does all this is really rather complicated, and really we don't know. Because it's such a mixture of protein fragments, it's almost impossible to apply known theory to it because they're all over the place. It's a big mess. That's the technical word for it. Okay, so what you can see is, if we then shear it a bit more, look, I took this one up to 500 pascals, the viscosity went to there, 1,000 pascals, 1,500 pascals, 2,000 pascals. It's always doing the same thing. It becomes less viscous, easier to spread, okay, and it will just do that. Okay, so it literally remembers what you've done to it, okay, which is really quite nice. And that characteristic of it going downwards like that, now that is well established in the science. and there is an equation which looks like Greek to you, and believe me, it is. Okay, this is the Cairo fluid equation, and that comes from Pierre Cairo in École Polytechnique in Montreal. And let's move on. Okay, so there is good science behind that sort of stuff. So the question is, how long does it remember? Is it truly Irish, where everything is measured in centuries, or something slightly? And of course, when I put this talk together, I did not realize how sad this is, okay? In that, for those of you who haven't watched the news, Michael Bond, the creator of Paddington, passed away this week. Anyway, at some point in the last few years, Unilever had got onto Paddington as a bit of marketing, okay? And note we have a Marmite jar here rather than a marmalade jar, okay? So what we're going to see is how long does it take for this stuff to get back to its original structure. So we're going to do a little test. We're going to shear it at this rate, 5 reciprocal seconds. And we're going to rest, and we're going to test it again, and then rest. So if you imagine this little cartoon, I'm shearing it for a long time, then I stop, and then I'll test it, then I'll stop, then I'll test it, stop and test it. Everybody get the general idea? So we're going to see how long it takes. So here's another graph for all you graphy people. Okay, here's time in hours. Here's the viscosity. Okay, so it would have started about 100 or something, and it's been sheared for a while. It's down to 22. Then you can see it's getting back up to 60 or 70 after 4 hours. Okay, it takes a long time to recover the structure, partly because it's a very, very dense colloidal suspension. You get all sorts of things where the salt actually inhibits all the charge interactions, etc., etc., etc. The good point is that Unilever just are very happy that this is the result. Okay, and in terms of modeling it, you spend a lot of time doing this. But let's move on. So it will take a long time to recover. So if someone has used the Marmite before you in the morning, don't be surprised if it's slightly different to what you expect, because it will have this memory of what you've done to it. Okay, so what does temperature do to it? Okay, well, that's very straightforward. Let's measure it at different temperatures. Here's the viscosity, here's the shear. And what I've done is I've taken it all up to the same stress. Now, if it's same stress, if it flows easily, you'll go up to a higher shear rate. And what can you see is at 25 degrees, oh, look, it goes back at this value, and that value gets smaller and smaller the warmer it gets. But it stays with this really quirky behavior, okay? The shear thinning followed by Newtonian. Okay, that isn't subject to temperature. And if you put this into a plot, there's your log of your viscosity against your temperature, all done that, and that is pretty strongly decreasing. Okay, so that's a log plot, and that means there is no need to put your Marmite in the fridge, okay? Because that's at 20 degrees. Can you imagine going back up to 5 degrees centigrade? This is why if you keep your Marmite in the fridge and then put it on your toast, you don't have toast anymore, right? You're saying, well, I'm just going to scrape some gravel on my bread, okay? So most people put things in fridges to, you know, sort of like keep them. You can see that Marmite will live forever outside the fridge, and if you're talking about flow properties, they're not helped by being in a fridge. Okay, so that's Marmite. Now let's get on to something slightly more closer to home. Okay, where it comes from. And here you have an example of a bitter, and here you have another example of a beer product. Okay, and the question is, does this make a big difference to the Marmite? Is anybody asking this? Yeah, so the question is, well, it turns out that the origin of the yeast has a small effect. The big thing is how much solids end up in the concentrate. And so what we have here is a plot of these funny curves I've been showing you, okay, the viscosity against the shear stress for different solids contents. And A has got a lower solids content than B, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really quite sensitive to the solids content. So this is about how that beer yeast cells, et cetera, go through the process. So one of the things we're doing with Unilever while we're doing this is trying and predict this, having been able to measure it. And that's another thing I'm not able to tell you about much. But what you can see, if you look at this characteristic viscosity, okay, and there's the solids content, it changes in that form, and that's a linear plot of solids content, and that's a log plot of apparent viscosity. So it makes a big difference. And this is what you expect for very dense suspensions. And so you'll get material, you'll put it through the process, it'll come out with a certain solids content, you go, oh, okay. And you put another one, and it goes through the process, and you get another solids content, and you go, Well, okay. And then you say, well, what I really want in the product is this apparent viscosity. So what you do is you blend them, okay, in order to get the target value. Because as a customer, you're expecting a certain rheology. It's not like, shall I say, certain wines where you are willing to pay large amounts of money to gamble on the quality of that year's wine. Everybody expects a similar thing. Maybe we could use the Scottish whiskey industry as an example of blends versus malts, etc., where you blend to get the desired characteristics. Anyway, so this creates all sorts of opportunities. So there will be blending, okay, in order to get your target. But every so often, you can take this off and say, well, what about if we could actually get a bit of a marketing thing with going for saying most of these comes from a certain extract. So that's where the Guinness Marmite came from. There's all sorts of bits and pieces down here where they're playing around with how you can use this to sell more. Because fundamentally, their problem is half the population love the product and half the population won't buy it, okay? So in order to make more money, you either have to persuade them to buy more often or to make the factory more efficient. And we'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. Okay, so blending is in there, but then blending also creates opportunities because we see that the amount of solids dictates this spreadiness, okay? So how can you use that? Well, there is one example. Is for people familiar with squeezy yogurt? You can't do with squeezy yogurt what you can do with regular yogurt because this one has a lower viscosity. So that came out whenever they were able to do these things and identify the viscosities, and they created the squeezy yogurt as squeezy Marmite as a possible thing. And that's where they then preferentially take lower viscosity materials and use that in squeezy stuff. Now that means there might be an excess of the stuff with lots of solids. And in fact, there has always been a market for large solids content Marmite, and it's in this country. Does anyone recognize which country that may be? It's Sri Lanka. Okay? So the question is, why on earth, literally, would people in Sri Lanka want Marmite? Anyone know? Are there any GPs in the room? Yeah? Martin? Any idea? No? Well, that's quite right. I would be very surprised. It's vitamin B deficiency. So Sri Lanka experienced lots of issues with vitamin B deficiency in the 1960s and 1970s. And a lot of their doctors had been British trained. And they said, well, actually, if people put some Marmite in their recipes, they would actually be able to counter this. And so in Sri Lanka, a lot of Marmite is sold as cooking stock. Okay, so if next time you're passing through Colombo or wandering around the gardens, you can look out for the twiglets or whatever they are, they will say. So yes, so there is this other market for Marmite. Okay, so moving on then, other parts of the world, we end up with the great spread off. Okay, here's the local speciality down there. Over there, there's this thing. Okay, Vegemite. Okay, and I've got a jar of Vegemite if anyone wants to inspect it. Afterwards, not now. Okay, and so, of course, the thing you notice here is that Vegemite is made by Kraft, so it's a direct competitor to Unilever, and we always have this question about which is better. Are they different? I'm not going to even go which is better, but I will go down there, are they different? Are there any Australians present? Okay. Are there any New Zealanders present? Okay, right. So what we're going to do is do the test, okay? So this is the characteristic which makes Marmite, shall we say, special. Okay, here's your shear rate, here's your apparent viscosity. As you increase the shear rate, it becomes less viscous, and then you take it back, okay, it keeps it, it remembers it, okay? That's what makes it so special. Now, in any competition, particularly between the British and the Australians, we need a referee. Right, so the obvious referee is Pierluigi Collina, okay, and so we'll use Nutella, another product often spread on the same thing. Are you happy with that? Okay, so this again is that. So what does Nutella do? Well, what you can see is Nutella starts off with a similar viscosity. It shear thins, it becomes less viscous, and then it becomes more viscous again. So, and this little gap is classical thixotropy. Okay, so Nutella is effectively a shear thinning fluid, a regular shear thinning fluid. So, what about the Australian stuff? There you go. Oh. The color scheme, of course, is deliberate. It starts off pretty thick for all the Australians present. And it gets weaker and weaker. On the way back, it gets stronger, having been beaten at the key number of 100. And what you can see is it's basically Nutella on steroids, so to speak, under this test. So, there we go. There is a big difference between Vegemite and Marmite, mechanically speaking, okay, from an engineering point of view. So there you go. We can also look at how it relates in terms of its rubberiness. If I was to talk about this thing about elasticity, remember the elastic band? So let's do that test. So here we have Marmite and Nutella. And actually, they're very similar, aren't they? Yeah. Okay. So what does Vegemite look like? Oh, I think that says it all. Yeah, so that's on the way out. You can see, again, it's got this elastic, low-strain behavior, but it's much, much tougher, okay? And the characteristic stress where it switches over is larger. Okay, so effectively, Vegemite is stiffer. It's stiffer, flows in a slightly different way, and doesn't remember what you've done to it as much, which is interesting. Okay, so that leaves us the other lot. Okay. I was very nervous what I'd be saying at this point today, because I wrote this before this morning. Okay, it's very nice that the British Lions can beat 14 New Zealanders. So here we have the sanitarium product, and here we have the British version. Okay, so here we have the answer. Okay, there's Marmite, there is Vegemite, and there is sanitarium Marmite. I'll let you interpret that as you see fit. I go to New Zealand regularly, like once a decade, because actually food engineering and food manufacturing is a really big part of the New Zealand economy. And so this is a good place to be a chemical engineer, and so I go and visit regularly. And so this is to be interpreted as you see fit. Okay, so in summary, what we've learned, technically speaking, and you can tell people, it's a structured liquid. And it's an example of a soft solid. It's solid under certain conditions, and other conditions it doesn't behave like a solid. Okay, now in terms of science, it's a rheologist theme park. It does all sorts of wonderful things. The shear thinning, the structure recovery, and it's got this really curious transition. Designing that into a product would be really quite difficult because we're still not quite sure what the origin is. Okay, but it happens, as in many natural food products, they have very quirky behavior, which are great, which we'd like to replicate if we could. And to answer the question, Vegemite does not equal Marmite. Mechanically speaking, it's the case. You're welcome to come and try for yourself. I want you to sign a waiver before you do the taste test and everything else. So I need to do a few acknowledgements. Obviously, David White, Dr. Marmite, Jeff is my colleague. Unilever and EPSRC sponsored David's PhD. Graham and Mike were the two people. If you're really interested in it, there's this paper you can look up on the topic. But the key person is this man, Martin Beckford. So Martin is a Jesuit. Martin is 1994 Jesuit. Okay? The key thing is, Martin was the factory manager of the Unilever factory in Burton-on-Trent. And he was in charge of the upgrading of the factory. Because the key point was, Unilever wanted to keep the brand, but they needed to improve its performance. And so what they did was they have actually rebuilt the factory completely. But in order to rebuild the factory, they had to understand how putting in modern technology, which would save time and money and energy and everything else, would that affect the product? And that's what spawned this PhD project. Now, Martin and I know each other quite well because Martin and I share an interest in field hockey. Okay, so there's Martin, okay, in the first 11, 1996, 1997, known as the Invincibles, okay. I draw your attention to their statistics: played 11, won 11, drawn 0, lost 0, 447 against 0. And the photograph isn't actually complete because I didn't make the photograph. I actually did show up for a few of the games, particularly against the Red Peril, known as St. John's, and of course they did not score any goals. Right, and that gets me to the end of the talk. I need to say thank you for hanging in there, and I think we'll take some questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
You said earlier that bacteria could not live in Marmite. It would last forever. Mm-hmm. Why is Marmite, therefore? Could it be a wonder medicine? I don't understand.
Bacteria won't live in Marmite because the bacteria cannot withstand the osmotic pressure. The word I did not use was spores. Okay, bacterial spores, and they can survive some really quite strong conditions. So that is one of the reasons why you shouldn't keep it for centuries. Okay, in terms of medicine, you're saying, yeah, what do you want to use it for? In terms of a vitamin enhancer, yes, it's very good. So you could keep it for that point, but you'd need to be able to make sure that there are no spores in it if you wanted to keep it forever. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yep, sir.
I don't drink much beer.
Mm-hmm.
But you showed an example which said champagne.
Yes.
This is very interesting for me.
My version is not here. So in that case, that was a Valentine's Day marketing move, and what they did is they put champagne into it. They added champagne into the Marmite. Yeah. No, there was no hint that you could actually make Marmite from champagne. The yeast. Sadly, for those people, no. Certainly.
During the war, bread wasn't rationed. It wasn't rationed until after the war. I'm talking about the recent one, not the 1780. And Marmite was a wonderful thing to spread so that you could eat the bread and get energy to work and fight and do everything else.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Anything else, folks? Oh, can we pass the mic?
If you were the GP and I was vitamin B deficient, how much Marmite would you advise me to eat?
I think the word is in moderation, isn't it? There is obviously a sodium level aspect to it, and this is the thing that always has to be played off with something like that that's so hard in salt, so high in salt, because it is very salty. So we'd have to look at the numbers and see what would the limits would be, or the daily recommended dose would be.
When
Sorry, there's a man behind you.
when you've worked out what it is about the structure of Marmite that makes it do what it does, what will you be able to do with it?
So the answer to that is, if we were able to work out how it all happens, then one could actually be much more efficient in saying what yeasts or what beers we're going to be using, what conditions we would process it at, etc., in order to get it to the desired target. Okay, so we wouldn't be overshooting and undershooting and doing trial and error. So that's in terms of making something like Marmite. That's why you want to have this process knowledge. The other thing is, if you wanted to make another material which had these sort of characteristics, then you would piggyback that knowledge into something else. And that's where the sort of, the engineering becomes the appliance of science. We know it works like this. Can we replicate that somewhere else? And that's how a lot of science is then transferred from one product to another. And that's a nice thing about being at a university with lots of different departments, is you can say, well, I work on this, but actually, exactly the same thing happens over there in this very, very different world. So some of the things I work on are edible, such as Marmite. Some of them are definitely inedible. And we'd never want them to put near our body. But the science underpinning their flow behavior is the same. And so that's the whole point about understanding where things happen and where they come from. We'll just pass the mic forward to you. Yep.
You talked about the changing physical properties when smearing or shearing. What happens to the physical properties when you stir Marmite? And does it make any difference if you stir it before you spread it?
Well, strictly speaking, stirring is just a badly posed shearing problem. And what I mean by badly posed, it means that different parts of the material experience different shear rates. The nice thing about the Rogers example was that everything was getting a nice uniform history, okay? So if you think about moving around in the bowl, the stuff a long way from the knife or the surface will not be sheared as much. So you get a bit of variation. Where it gets very interesting is actually if you start to stretch it. If you could create some stretching, you get some very interesting things. So you can actually foam Marmite. You can foam Marmite by doing some extreme stretching to it. And that's really quite fun. Yeah. Not when you're trying to do a rheometry test on it. It's a bit like Woody Allen, the sleeper. Sort of started to leave the device because it foamed. Yeah, we got a question up there. In most cases, when you're stirring in your pot, you'll even that out quite easily. But if you were just, it's a bit like paint stirring. You know, you have to move it around to make sure everything's experienced some sort of shear.
Are you allowed to say, in marketing terms, what happened when the trial run with Guinness was used and anything happened on sales or brand image?
All I know is they sold every single pot, and I couldn't get a second pot. So I guess that means it worked. It was a limited run. It was a special edition.
Won't be used again.
Find someone from Unilever. Yeah, and ask them. So, yeah. Yep.
My experience of Marmite is that if you try a jar that hasn't been used for some time, some weeks or months, it's a lot stiffer than an ordinary jar that's been sitting on the shelf.
So you haven't used it?
So if you have a jar of Marmite that's been sitting in your cupboard for 6 months, you take it out, it's a lot stiffer than a jar which you just bought from the shop.
Yeah, that could well be the case. Have you opened the jar that was in the cupboard?
No, they're
Did you open the jar? Yeah, but in the stuff that you opened originally, you could have had stuff evaporate from it. So the question whether or not it has exactly got the same water content. There are all sorts of things that happen over time with the stuff. The stuff that's in the that's delivered to the shop, they're trying to get the same consistency on that. What happens as soon as you open it then becomes a product of your storage characteristics. So I can't explain every single jar. Tim?
Have you established a lower limit for the viscosity?
A lower limit?
Yeah.
In terms of what the consumer will...
No, just from a point of academic interest.
Okay, so the answer is no, because we run into more artifacts that happen in the test. One of the things is in these squidgy tests, when you start to go faster, it'll actually fly out under centrifugal force. Okay, so you have a coat around that. Then you get these foaming issues, which can arise, and that's effectively because it's cavitating under very high shear rates. So we'd have to do it in a machine if we really wanted to go down there. But we're way off the scale in terms of what people spread with the measurements we do. So there's a question down here as well as... Sorry, if you take people, if you come down, there's...
Are you aware of some difference in the manufacturing process that gives rise to that difference structurally between Marmite and Vegemite?
No. Simple as that. It's simple as that.
I don't think there are any lawyers in the room. If you...
No, but we're being live streamed. But it's an honest answer. I've never really looked into how Vegemite is made. So I'm sure someone from Kraft would be happy to send me lots of stuff. Yeah. We've got one at the back.
One of your charts showed the word thixotropic. Paint industry went through a business period of thixotropic paint. Does that follow the same sort of objective as Marmite?
It is exactly the same thing. So you have your paint, it keeps in your pot, you take it out, and as you start to spread, it goes in smooth, very, very, very smoothly. And the other thing about thixotropy is that it takes a long time to recover the original viscosity. So thixotropy is referred to its time behavior, its memory. So the idea is once you start to shear the stuff, then it will spread quite nicely for quite a while. And so the opposite is rheopectic materials, which do the opposite. They actually shear thicken over time, and you're going, oh, you don't want that. So yeah, it's exactly the same science, and people might be using it for paint. It's a spread at its cruelest sense, and so it's exactly the same wording.
One of the problems with Marmite, which I think you touched on, was its salt content. Mm-hmm. And we're often being told that salt is not good for us. From your position, I mean, can you see a way in which that salt content can be lowered without affecting the product?
Well, there's two answers to the question about the salt content. The first question is how specific the physiological responses are to the identity of the anion, sodium versus all sorts of ions, sodium, calcium, potassium, etc. So, of course, if it was specific to sodium, you could look at replacing the autolysis liquid with, say, potassium chloride or something like that. The other question is then, again, as the question we had earlier, what's the level, etc., where it starts to become an issue? You know, if you're going to have all this salt around, what level can you have in the product? The alternative is actually go to alternative or milder autolysis conditions and using something like ultrasound to rupture the cells. Okay, so you would actually you'd use mechanical energy to rupture the cells in addition to that. But of course, you're tied into a product which has a certain amount of saltiness. So this is again the challenge of how do you keep the customer on board as you make it healthier. Okay, and this is one of the big issues in the food industry is how do you maintain the taste side of the food while balancing it with the health and other performance things. So if anyone is here who's worked in the food industry, they'll know there are many stories of this. Each time let's say the media comes up with a story about food issues, you're saying, well, how do we balance that, etc. So as an example, one of the big things in the UK, more than 10 years ago was BSE. So BSE, mad cow disease. And the food industry had to deal with how do we replace beef gelatin in our products. Right? It's everywhere, or it was everywhere. And you had a lot of work happening there as a result of that issue. Okay. Okay, one more. Does it have to be very fresh? I don't think they do get it to hang around simply because it's yeast. It will start to die, and it'll be sitting in a tanker. The guy wants to use his tanker for something else, so it's usually shipped in. They process as much as they can when they can. Yep. Okay, right. So everyone, it is 5:02. Thank you for hanging around. The next talk is at 1:15. And feel free to look through the cookbook, etc., etc.
That's right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful new lecture room. I imagine it's the first time you've heard a lecture in this space, and it's certainly the first time I've given one, so let's hope it goes well. If I'm not audible, gesture from the back, but I think everything should go swimmingly. So my name's Janet Soskice. I'm currently the president of Jesus, and it's my pleasure to speak to you to this title, The Amazing Lady Bible Hunters, Victorian Adventures in Ottoman Egypt. And people often ask me how I heard about the two ladies who are my subject today, who rejoiced in the name Agnes and Margaret Smith. Let me tell you, if you're writing a book about Agnes and Margaret Smith, you can expect a lot of dead facial expressions when people say, what are you working on? But it was easy because, in a sense, here, if you go round the backs at the end, the roundabout at the end of the backs, you'll see the gate, which is Westminster College, the URC College, United Reform. It was the Presbyterian College, and you see in there an obelisk, and over the gates, this insignia, which is the burning bush. It is the insignia of the Reformed Communion, the Presbyterians worldwide, but especially relevant to the ladies I'm going to talk about today, devout Presbyterians. And it is, of course, the burning bush, famous from Moses in the book of Exodus. Underneath it, the Latin nec tamen consumabatur, and it was not consumed. Now, the ladies I wrote about started farish from Cambridge in 1843. They were born in Irvine, just south of Glasgow, rather sleepy and depressed economically town in their day. And there's roughly what it looks like. Their father was a boy from a poor family who'd been enabled by Scotland's very good supportive system to become a lawyer, or a writer as they were called in Scotland. He married quite late, was already quite affluent, and unfortunately his wife died giving birth to their first children, twins, who they called Agnes and Margaret. He brought these girls up by himself with a series of nannies. There was fortunately a very good school that took girls as well as boys to the age of 14 or 15 in Irvine, which was quite unusual. And he educated them pretty much as he would have done sons. And he had some innovative ideas. He particularly, for every language that they learned, he promised to take them to the country where that language was spoken. And since they were twins and they could use each other as tutorial partners, they acquired quite speedily French and German and other European language in this happy fashion. And their father was a keen traveler. Now, in these days, we're talking about the 1850s, railroads were still very new. And the main way even middle-class people traveled in Europe, most didn't travel in Europe, was that you'd have your travel agent or courier went with you and made all the bookings all the way along. But Agnes and Margaret's father despised such things, and he thought it was much more fun if you knew the language yourself to be your own courier. So they were accustomed. They benefited from this rash of railroads that spread across Britain and then Europe, and benefited in more than one way because their father invested in them. He was a man of law for a distant relation who, when he died in the small town of Irvine, it turned out his estate was the largest one ever to go through the Scottish courts. This is because he had 4 uncles who went to America early on around the time of the Revolution, all made huge amounts of money, and they all died intestate with this huge, couldn't make this up, with this huge fortune echoing down to the solitary bachelor in Irvine. And when he died, he left the twins' father a great deal of money, probably 9 or 10 million pounds in today's money, but he was already substantially well off. At that stage, he was the executor of this benefactor's estate. He went to the United States to liquidate the assets, and the girls were sent to a boarding school for the daughters of dissenters in Birkenhead. I've never been able to trace it, but it sounds dreadful and wonderful at the same time. And this is a picture of Agnes, the earliest picture I have of either of them from about that time. And it must have been terrifying for them because as far as they knew, their father was the only relative they had in the world. They didn't have any uncles, aunts, cousins, and there he was far away. But he came back, and then he sent them after Birkenhead to a finishing school in Knightsbridge. Now, this was in some ways against his sensibility because he and his daughters were completely against any kind of ostentation or snobbery. And I think one of the main objectives of finishing schools in Knightsbridge in that day was to eradicate any local accent. But these two ladies retained heavy Ayrshire accents, thick Ayrshire accents to their dying day, despite speaking about 10 or 12 other languages. So I think this was deliberate. Anyway, they clearly, I think that what their father realized is they were going to be considerable heiresses. He took extreme steps to protect their fortune from scalp hunters, and he also made sure that they knew how to run a household and so on. But the difficulty is you couldn't really run a household unless you had a husband or an uncle or an aunt or someone whose household you needed to run. And they had none of these useful appurtenances. When their father came back, he retired from legal practice and he moved to a small village outside Glasgow. And I think he maybe hoped that one of these very intelligent, well-educated daughters would have married a professor in the university or a clergyman or something like this, but it was not to be because he died, not intestate. He died when they were aged about 23, rather unexpectedly, leaving them all alone in the world, apart, of course, from each other, and very, very rich. So what should they do? They decided to go down the Nile. Now, this was not what most Presbyterians did in the 1860s. Most British people got heavily lined black stationery. They wore black all the time. They didn't go down the Nile. And they particularly didn't go down the Nile unaccompanied by any men, but just with one of their former school teachers from London days, another Scottish woman called Grace, who was in her mid-30s. So the two 23-year-olds and a woman in her mid-30s, they are obviously planning the trip of a lifetime because they went all the way across Europe to the Danube, down the Danube to the Black Sea, and over to Constantinople as it was, then by packet steamer across to Egypt. And they were planning to go on horseback through Palestine as it was then too. Now, they had been most places in Europe, and it clearly wouldn't have done to go to Saint-Tropez when you're recently bereaved. But for devout Presbyterians, remember that Egypt at this time, well before the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in the 1920s, this is the 1860s, Egypt for most English-speaking people was a Bible land. It was the place of Joseph and his many-colored coat. It was the place of Moses and his encounters with the Pharaoh and let my people go. And so indeed the year they went down was also the first year that Thomas Cook ran an Egyptian tour, which they marketed as a Bible tour. So now, there are a number of ways to go down the Nile. You could go on steamboats that ran the length of the thing, but the nice way to do it was to hire your own boat. And this was thought to be quite luxurious. Nilotic travel at this stage, if you rented your own boat, was quite... It both satisfied Presbyterian scruples about being biblical, but it was pretty grand. And one of the things I discovered is that they planned this whole thing in the months after their father's death, from a Baedeker's guide sort of thing to Egypt, which told you even what kind of torches to take so you wouldn't damage tomb wall paintings, and what kind of wine to drink on the Nile, a little white hawk. And also never to let your boatman go into the water without drawers on if there were ladies on board, things like this. But it also said you should get a small gun for firing off. When I was writing the book, I wondered why they'd got this small gun for firing off until I read the guidebook. And there it said that since the distance, what you ideally wanted to do was to entertain other glamorous people who had their own boats. And since a dinner gong could not be heard, you had a small gun for firing off. So you'd fire it off in time for people to change into their dinner jackets and fire it off again for them to be rowed across over to your boat. So they obviously, I think they thought that they might meet the better kind of traveler. The main guidebook that people took for a trip down the Nile at this time, the main guidebook was Herodotus in Greek, and as well as the Bible. And indeed, these two ladies were reading both of these books, both in Greek. So anyway, I have to cut this part of the story short because I want to get to the other bits. But it didn't work out to be the glamorous jaunt they thought, because they were bamboozled. They were bamboozled by their dragoman, partly because they failed in their own, to observe their own travel wisdom, which is always learn the language of the country before you go. And although they had European languages by the shed load, they didn't have Arabic, and so they were resoundingly treated by their Maltese guide. And they were able, fortunately, to drop him before traveling through Palestine on horseback with tents. The first time, they'd never traveled and slept in tents with their father, so this was new. So when they came back to Scotland, what should they do? I mean, it was a very small town, it still is. Kilbarchan is a tiny hamlet. And they really, you know, even teaching Sunday school once a week was like to 3 or 4 children. There was nothing to do, so they moved to London. Again, not their natural place, but as far as I can see, the London they lived in was basically Scottish. They lived in an expat community. They went to the church, they worked in their soup kitchens, they taught Sunday school, and they learned languages. They learned Arabic because they wanted to know Arabic for the next time they went to the East. And unusually, they learned modern Greek. They learned modern Greek because they were under the misapprehension, popularized by Professor Blackie of Edinburgh, that the best guide to the pronunciation of ancient Greek was the way modern Athenians spoke their own language. This turns out to be philological rubbish, but it was really, really good advice for them, because most British men who'd been to a public school at this stage would have had a good competence in reading Greek, but couldn't have expressed a word of Greek to a person in Greece, because the pronunciation still that one has in school is Erasmian, and not anything to do with what Greeks do with their language. So these two ladies did learn modern Greek, and Agnes in London wrote a book about their travels, which was quite a success, not least because they had been hoodwinked. And Margaret fell in love. She fell in love with a Presbyterian clergyman called James Gibson, some 20 years older than they were, who was a charming person, but melancholic. He hadn't wanted to go into the church. His father had suggested that port of call for him. And after his father died and left him a legacy, he was able to spend his time traveling around from various spas, worrying about his health and his imminent demise. And also, he befriended someone who was interested in Cervantes and Spanish letters, so he became working on Spanish letters. So he and Margaret entered into a long courtship. And, but this wasn't to stop the twins from traveling. And here you have a shot of Agnes dressed in Greek costume, because having had some success with her travel book and having written 3 disastrous novels, which I am possibly the only person in the world to have read, very, very sub-George Eliot, except for the heroines are always devout Presbyterian women who are rescued by... But interesting, because the plots revolve around what do you do if you've got a lot of money and nothing to do with it. Because they're driven by this Presbyterian, everyone must have a vocation, everyone must do something worthwhile in their life. But what if you're a woman at this stage, what do you do? I mean, a lot of women could devote their fortune to, in the novels, they marry a reforming MP or someone like that, or a reforming businessman. But this wasn't to be with Agnes and Margaret. So with James Gibson dallying on, it was 12 or 13 years. They'd been engaged, and Gibson kept breaking off the engagement. And although I didn't invent any dialogue for the book, I can almost hear his voice saying, "Oh, my dear, but you are so young and fresh, and I am so old and soon to leave this world." I just almost hear that. But the twins went to Greece on a trip, and they traveled with mules. They, again, in the Peloponnese, and this was something even wealthy Greek people did not do. They hoped, I think, to talk to local people, and Agnes wanted to write another book. But of course, Greece was only recently out of Ottoman rule, and the women still observed purdah. They didn't even do their own shopping. So, you know, it wasn't like you were Lord Byron. You could just stop into a tavern and have a drink with a few people. If you're a Presbyterian woman, in tight skirts, speaking Greek with a heavy Scottish accent, really, you don't just bump into people in the street and talk to them. and even the women, but who they did find would speak to them were Orthodox monks. Now, as Presbyterians, Greek Orthodoxy was just about everything they'd been brought up to really think was terrible. Icons, processing, Bibles encrusted with jewels. As Agnes said, far too many Kyrie eleisons. But they did learn that the monks loved the Bible. And Agnes said, anyway, if you got into trouble when talking to an Orthodox prelate, you could change the conversation by turning to the conversation to a common enemy and talk about the Pope. So that's a little bit of ecumenical advice there. So anyway, this trip did have one sterling advantage for them, that James Gibson, here you see him, was so distressed at Margaret's going out of his eyesight that he actually ventured out of Britain for the first time in many years and met them in Germany, where they were married. And this was the card that was sent to announce their wedding. So there you see them sitting, and here he finally makes his move. And then but notice when they traveled, they had, of course, to take they had to have hats and jewelry. They wore couture frocks, which they bought in Paris on the way. They had to travel in this way, even when they're traveling on horseback in the Peloponnese. They didn't imagine dress up every night, but they had to have all this gear. So now entered a very happy stage of their life. There was no question but the twins would live together, and so they took a house in Surrey. There you see Margaret on horseback. They were fine horsewomen. They helped James Gibson edit his work. They wrote poetry, but sadly, and here during this time, he wouldn't allow Margaret to travel, but during this time, Agnes went to Cyprus with their friend Grace, who'd accompanied them as chaperone. This is a drawing by Grace traveling around Cyprus, of course, where they met more monks in other Greek-speaking land. But sadly, not long after she got back, her brother-in-law, James Gibson, having thought for all of his adult life that he was soon to die, suddenly did when he wasn't expecting to. And Agnes wrote in her memoir of her brother, it was slightly humorless. I don't think she meant it to be funny, but she mentions that he sent her out that morning to buy him long underwear, much in the spirit of a man who intended to wear it. So there you go. But this was a great sadness, a heartbreaking sadness for her sister. And in one of the few admissions I find in Agnes's writings of any weakness, she said, I didn't dare to leave Maggie alone in those months after. She was heartbroken. She deeply loved this man. It had been 13 years of courtship before they got married, 3 years of wedded bliss. So they decided to take another trip, their sovereign cure for unhappiness, and they went only as far as Cambridge, which they'd read all about. And on the last day of their visit, they went into the Parker Library in Corpus, and there met the librarian. Now, I think many of you will know about the Parker Library. The Parker Librarian is not one who stamps out books for undergrads. The Parker Library is a fabulous collection put together by Archbishop Parker shortly after the English Reformation. He got a lot of books from monastic libraries. It contains fantastic things. I think it's one of the largest collections of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts in the world. It contains the draft edition of the 39 Articles of the Church of England. Anyway, Agnes engaged in discussion with this man, Samuel Lewis, who was a classicist and also a collector, a traveler in the East. And she was writing up her tales of travel in Cyprus, and he said, would you like to come and see my etchings of Cyprus? He really did say this, and they did, and 9 months later, Agnes married Samuel. He designed and built this home, which if you've ever been to, it belongs to Clare. It's now a hall of residence, Castle Bray, on the Chesterton Road. And they designed it with this porte-clocher tower there, I suppose to shelter their guests, but also because they put exercise ropes in this tower, because they took exercise every day on ropes, and they apparently had scandalized neighbors in their rental accommodation by exercising on parallel bars in the back garden in their bloomers, which they could avoid by this. So they there enjoyed a terrific life, because Samuel Lewis was far from being shy. He was very social. He was always bringing people home to their polyglot household. Agnes and Margaret themselves had a large circle of people, particularly people interested in the Bible, but not just that. For instance, they were close friends of Mary Kingsley and mentors of Mary Kingsley, who later became a great pioneer of travel in West Africa. And they were close friends of Solomon Schechter and his wife, the university's Jewish reader in rabbinics, of whom we'll hear more. So again, unfortunately, after 3 years, the same, Samuel died suddenly, and again, they were bereaved, both of them. So what should they do? They had long wanted to go to St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, which was famous for the discovery in the 1840s of the Codex Sinaiticus, which I imagine a lot of you have seen. It's the absolute jewel in the crown of the British Library, the oldest complete biblical text that we have. Because we have to remember at the beginning of the 19th century that the oldest Greek manuscripts that were ready of access for scholars were Byzantine. They weren't very old at all. And in a skeptical century, it was easy for people to say, well, how do we know the Bible's that old? And the Bible as we have it, and the books as we have it. And indeed, this discovery by von Tischendorf of a complete Bible that antedated any other similar volume by about 800 years was as astonishing as finding a new continent. So he had found this at St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. And of course, that was also famous because it's ostensibly built on the site where Moses was addressed by God from the burning bush. So they decided to make this trip. And they heard about this fellow, James Rendell Harris. Agnes read a book by him, a Quaker scholar. He'd gone recently, and most people thought that every manuscript worth discovering had been discovered by von Tischendorf, but he'd found other things, and he thought there were especially things in Syriac, which is a Semitic language related to Hebrew, that hadn't been looked at. Agnes read a book about this and then engineered a meeting with him, and he was a great mentor to them. He thought they were just the right people to go to Sinai because they spoke modern Greek, which is what the monks spoke. They were used to traveling, and they spoke Arabic by this time. So he encouraged them to go to Sinai. And I imagine some of you have been, you know that St. Catherine's Monastery is around about there in the South Sinai Peninsula, and it's a place of astonishing natural beauty still today. So Agnes and Margaret set out. This was a big thing to do, and they were by now 49 years old, which in those days was quite an age to be doing something like this, both widowed. And they had to go to Cairo, of course, and hire a guide, or dragoman as they're called, who hired all the Bedouin drivers and the camels and so on, and set out for St. Catherine's. Now, they weren't sure of admission, and there were many naysayers in Cambridge who said, well, women, you know about Mount Athos, you won't even be admitted because you're women. But they thought they would be, and they had various things, missions that scholars from Corpus and other colleges had given them to do. And Agnes, for the purpose, had taught herself Syriac from a German Syriac dictionary, since there wasn't an English Syriac dictionary. And she said it wasn't that difficult if you already knew Hebrew, but I've never heard. We all have that. Well, most of us, there are some Syriac speakers I can see in the room. Anyway, this fabulous monastery, which again, probably some of you have been to, built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, at the same time as Ravenna, with this fabulous mosaic still intact. The walls sometimes 25 meters tall. They don't look so in this picture, but it's a most rugged place, crouching in the wadi there. And so they went out, and they discovered that the people who were really unwelcome at St. Catherine's were Western scholars, because so many of them had stolen things from the monks. But the monks were pleased. They had really loved Rendell Harris, who they knew. The twins spoke modern Greek, and they were welcomed in. This is the burning bush as it was at that time. This is the burning bush as it was, just a few years ago, and on one of my recent trips. And where they keep a fire extinguisher. So after the pleasantries, the monk librarian said, "What would you like to see?" And Rendell Harris had told Agnes and Margaret something that wasn't there in the book. He said that underneath the Archbishop's lodgings there was a dark room, off it a closet, in which there were a lot of derelict manuscripts and books, and some in Syriac, and he thought some might be important. So she asked to see these, and they hauled to the light of day a chest of things, and in this was this grubby volume. It was Syriac, and Agnes had, it was a palimpsest. Agnes could see this. That meant it's written on skin, and the skin was extremely valuable, especially in Sinai, where there weren't a lot of mammals to skin to create new writing materials. So what the monks would do is they would scrape the skins and then write another text over it. But over the centuries, the underwriting would seep through. Here you can see, this is a better photograph of the manuscript, and you can see on the right the way the underwriting has seeped through. And the overwriting was also Syriac. It was a Lives of Women Saints that existed in many copies. This is another copy. But Agnes could see at the top of the page, according to Matthew, according to Luke, and she realized the palimpsested text must have been a Gospels. And she had good luck with it because the overwriting of the scribe dated it to 697, and she reckoned the earlier text must have been much earlier than that. So there you go. This is just a Sinai shot, and you see how remote it is. So they had taken a camera. Rendell Harris had said, "You must take a camera," and he'd helped them buy a camera and a stand for photographing. And at this stage, of course, only Agnes knew Syriac. She was convinced this was important. The monk librarian didn't know Syriac. None of the monks at this stage did. And he thought it was somewhat bizarre that they were ignoring these fantastic jeweled medieval volumes they had in favor of this grubby thing. But she took over 500 photographs of this and was very keen to get them back and develop them and show them to the scholars in Cambridge. There were two Syriac scholars that were distinguished. There was Professor Bensley and this man, Francis Burkett, then aged about 33, who was Professor Bensley's right-hand man. And Agnes and Margaret knew these two men. They'd been next-door neighbors when they were in rental accommodation in Harvey Road. But they couldn't, for some reason, get them to look at Agnes's photographs. Even when Agnes says rather cryptically in a letter to Rendell Harris, even when I tried to show them to Professor Bensley in his own garden. So whether she went to a garden party armed with photographs of a Syriac palimpsest, I don't know. But you can imagine these women had no university degrees. They were just widows, just Scottish, just Presbyterian. They were just outside every magic circle of Cambridge life at that time. And anyway, they were not without cunning, however. And what they did is they invited the beautiful Persis Burkett, young Francis Burkett's wife, to come to have dinner and said, of course, bring Mr. Burkett. And they arranged their best photographs on the piano. They made sure they'd invited bishops and other dignitaries. And at a certain stage, they said, "And now, Mr. Burkett, you'll surely want to see our photographs," which he had not wished to, but had no excuse. And so he looked at them, and to his credit, immediately realized they were important, and nothing would do, but they had to arrange an expedition, top secret, to go to Sinai. And one of the ironies of this was that although these two ladies, Agnes and Margaret, had traveled by now all alone, unchaperoned in the Levant, it was unseemly that they should do so with British men who are not their husbands. So the resolution of this is that Persis Burkett came, and also Mrs. Bensley, who was in her 60s and nearly blind, and the twins asked Rendell Harris, who was their great friend, to come along too. So here they are, sleeping in the desert. You can see that's Mrs. Bensley with the band around her hat, and Persis at the front. Their dragoman, Ahmed, who's always looking rather stressed, having a cigarette and with a pistol at his side. And they went to St. Catherine's and began to transcribe the manuscript. They went in February, stayed through. Always, it seems, everything in Sinai happens 40 days, 40 years. There were 40 days. You had to bring all your own provisions because the monks simply didn't have anything extra. And there you see them transcribing the manuscript. It turned out that Professor Bensley and Mr. Burkett didn't speak modern Greek, and the monks didn't take to them. They didn't trust them, but they did trust Agnes, and they let her have the manuscript in her room. Of course, she and Margaret weren't involved in the transcription, but the monks befriended them and Rendell Harris. Here you see Rendell Harris and the monk librarian, Father Galactian. And here, I think, indicating a more suspicious note, we see the young, handsome Mr. Burkett and Professor Bensley in the background, looking faintly sinister. And so there was tensions in the party. What did the women do? Mrs. Bensley made out of her son's school scarf a little case for the palimpsest, which the monk librarian only rediscovered about 5 years ago when they were renovating the library. And Agnes and Margaret received permission to do a catalogue of the Syriac and Arabic manuscripts. And so this was very important because these manuscripts were uncatalogued. And as you'll appreciate, if you have an uncatalogued collection, anything can go missing and you don't know. And a lot was going missing. And many scholars had asked permission to catalogue the collections but been refused because anyone who's in a position to write the catalogue can leave a few things out and just nick them. So Agnes and Margaret were trusted. So here's Agnes's catalogue of Syriac manuscripts into Greek, because of course the monks didn't read English. She did Syriac into Greek in the daytime, translated Syriac into English in the evening. Margaret had the bigger task of cataloging Arabic into Greek. And here's a picture of the whole crew of them there with Margaret, all their cooks and waiter and so on. So this was very exciting. They had sent a letter to the Times from Cairo indicating they thought this find might be second only to the discovery of the Codex Sinaiticus. They sent another such letter from Sinai, and they were all convinced they'd get back to England and find everyone was agog to see them. But they had a big fight while they were still at Sinai about who should receive credit for finding the manuscript. Because, of course, Agnes and Margaret believed that Agnes had found it. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she had a good guess. She knew it was palimpsest, that it was Gospels, that it was very old. And Burkett and Bensley thought that honor should go to Professor Bensley. So they had a big fight about this, and things passed awkwardly. And when they got to Suez, they all went their different ways. The Burketts went to spend some weeks on the Riviera. The Bensleys went to Rome. And so Agnes and Margaret were the first to get back to Cambridge, and they discovered no one knew anything about their great find, and no one even knew they'd been away, so it was kind of disappointing. But 2 or 3 days later, the story was broken in a national paper. I always forget which one, the London Daily News. Yes, Agnes said, not a paper one reads. But this story of this great find was broken, but it was broken in a jumbled way because it had come through a stringer in Germany who'd known a friend who Rendell Harris had been writing to. And so it didn't make any mention of Burkett and Bensley as having been on the trip. It mentioned Rendell Harris, it mentioned the twins, it mentioned the importance of the manuscript. Now this was disastrous because part of the resentment, and while still in Sinai, is that it turned out Burkett and Bensley had not wanted Rendell Harris, the twins' great friend, along at all, because they thought he was there to try to steal credit. And this just seemed to validate that hypothesis. So it was a dreadful time. Agnes and Margaret were very upset because they thought Burkett and Bensley would think the worst, and so they did. Professor Bensley read about this find in Rome and was apocalyptic. They got back to Cambridge and he was firing letters off, but he went into dinner in his college quays and he ate oysters and drank stout and died. So I'm sure we won't serve anything like that today. But there, again, his friends had warned him not to go to Sinai because it was so dangerous of a man of his age and with uncertain health. But it turned out dinner in quays was what really finished him off. But now it was very difficult because Agnes had been given the contract to publish the transcription of the manuscript. Two-thirds of the transcription was out of her hands. In fact, the whole thing hadn't been completed because they hadn't completed it. So what should she do? Fortunately, I think I would have given up. I would have handed it all over to Mr. Burkett, and I think that's rather what he thought. But that's not what Agnes and Margaret thought was right. So what they did, Margaret learned Syriac. They produced this wonderful transcript. They could have so much blown up in their face, because if this hadn't been a flawless academic work, and remember they had no formal degrees, they'd only studied Syriac for a couple of years, it would have looked, everyone would have poured scorn on them. In fact, it was a great triumph, and it was a marvelous success. In the course of it, these two ladies, here you see them, this is a picture in the newspaper from the time. They, at the same time, I'm skipping all their involvement with Westminster College, but they had paid they were the major benefactors for the founding of this Presbyterian College in Cambridge. That's Margaret, and that's Agnes at the time. They had, as I said, the manuscript hadn't been quite complete, so they'd had to go back to Sinai. And this had a very interesting effect, because by now they were considerable scholars of ancient manuscripts. They knew how to travel. They knew they could read the manuscripts, and dealers were bringing them things. They entirely disapproved of alienating manuscripts from the monks, from the libraries, but they approved of taking them. Manuscripts were now leaking onto the markets because people were traveling down the Nile for pleasure, for hunting, buying the manuscripts, or even dealers were taking manuscripts apart and just selling old pages as curios. So Agnes and Margaret were told, they'd been 2 or 3 times to Sinai transcribing this palimpsest, but they were told at one stage there were a lot of Hebrew manuscripts leaking onto the market in Cairo. And so they went down, they bought something like 4,000 manuscripts just from the markets and around. When I say manuscripts, some might be just a page, right? They weren't full books, some were full books. And when they came back, they were going over them, and they didn't recognize everything. So they asked this good friend of theirs, Solomon Schechter, who, as I've said, was the reader in rabbinics at the university, and to come and look. And he realized they were very, very important Hebrew manuscripts, and he reckoned there must be a Genizah in Cairo. Well, what's a Genizah? In developed Jewish practice, you can't destroy anything that has the holy name, the tetragrammaton on it. You have to bury it or treat it with the reverence you would to a body, a human body. And in Northern Europe, things would be buried, old Torah scrolls and so on. But the Jews of Cairo, being in a very dry place, simply constructed off the women's gallery in the oldest synagogue in Cairo, a windowless room. This window you see up in the wall was the one way into this, and for 800 years had been just tipping stuff in there. And this included, the top layers were printed books that had the tetragrammaton on it, but the bottom layers included the famous philosopher Maimonides' first draft of his Guide to the Perplexed in his own hand, letters from his brothers to him about trading in India, love spells, potions. There's a wonderful exhibition on now, I think it's still on, at the UL on the Genizah, where Agnes and Margaret are given pride of place. And indeed, Schechter asked them to go with him. They were ill at first, but they went back and helped him bring these treasures back to Cambridge, because the chief rabbi asked Schechter what he would like to take back to Cambridge, and Schechter said everything. And so it came back in these kind of packing cases. There you see Schechter trying to sort it all out. And it is probably the most important collection of Jewish manuscripts in the world, certainly for medieval Judaism. And fascinating. Well, that, I think, brings me, I have one last photograph of Agnes and Margaret. No. Yes, I do. So this is the last photograph I have of this. This is 1914. Because, of course, we may regard them as Victorian ladies, but they regarded themselves as entirely modern. I'm sure if they'd been able to go to Sinai in a biplane, they would have done so. But as it is, this is a photograph with a young friend and in a mock-up biplane. But I think certainly their lives lived up to this wonderful emblem and it was not consumed. Thank you. About 5 minutes? How long do we have?
Yeah, we have until 5-10 minutes.
So we have time for a few questions before you'll all want your tea.
It's hard to imagine them carrying all their funds with them, such an obvious opportunity for theft. How do they access the funds they needed for these very expensive trips on their travels?
How did they carry money with them?
How do they access money or carry?
I honestly don't know. I haven't thought about that, but I imagine there must have been some paper way of doing that, because they wouldn't have carried gold or anything like that. That was too dangerous. In fact, a Cambridge professor of Arabic had been murdered in Sinai about not long before they went, because he was carrying about 20,000 pounds worth of gold on him, which was bad travel advice. So I don't know. I'll have to look that up. That's a very interesting point. I would say they arranged everything through the British diplomats and so on. It may have been that there were letters of surety you could give.
Letters of credit.
Letters of credit. Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I understand that nowadays there's quite a lot of skepticism around as to whether the St. Catherine's Monastery site really is the site where Moses saw the burning bush. Was that any part of their interest in the subject, or? Oh
no, they absolutely believed it was, and they discovered one. They went 6 times altogether, and they discovered one of their dragomen. They had Muslim, they had Coptic, they had different dragomen. They discovered one of their dragomen didn't believe the story of Moses to be true, and they said we should never have hired him. The monks, already by some of the earliest travel accounts we have of people going to Sinai are like 4th, 5th century, and they already designate the same spots where the rock was cleft and the water poured from the stone and so on. And Agnes and Margaret didn't necessarily believe that. They thought it was highly likely that they didn't believe every point that had been denoted by the monks, but they did believe that that site was the site that was happened, and firmly in the Moses story. Yeah. I did want to say too that in our audience here is Dr. Peter Williams, OJM, who is the principal of Tyndale House and is a great Syriac scholar and has working in Tyndale House on one of the manuscripts that they collected, so that's nice.
How did you get involved in all this yourself?
Well, I got involved. I'm, yes, a philosopher of religion, so what am I doing? I got involved because I am writing a book on the names and the naming of God, and so the Tetragrammaton, in the history of Jewish and Christian thought, the Tetragrammaton figures largely in this, and the Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush, where Moses cryptically asked God for a name, and God says, I am who I am. And so I just wanted to go, and once gone, I was quite fascinated, and when I came back, someone told me, I think, about these 2 ladies, and it was interesting because I'd been in and out of Westminster College many times and must have seen their huge, rather terrible portraits done post-mortem from photographs are there, and I must have seen them, but it's one of those things that before your eyes and you don't see, so that's when I got interested. Yes, okay, so the earliest large Christian church is the first language into which, now I'll go a few steps back. Hebrew was largely a dead language by the time of Jesus, and most Jews of the extensive diaspora spoke, educated Jews spoke Greek, but the more common language was Aramaic, and that was the language of Jesus and the disciple, and Aramaic and Syriac are very close. So the New Testament we know was written in Greek, but the earliest language into which it was translated was Syriac. And the early Syriac church, which is the truly Eastern, not the Eastern Orthodox is West compared to the Syriac church, that's the church that goes endangered in Mosul, that church that was in Iran and Iraq, and it spread all the way up the Silk Road. There are Syriac monasteries. So that's the Syriac church. So these, and ditto Arabic, because there were, of course, a lot of Arabic-speaking Christians, and these manuscripts would come down with monks probably on pilgrimage or fleeing persecution down from the Euphrates Valley down to Sinai, where they rested. Mm-hmm. Mm. One more question?
There's, of course, a lot of danger translating between languages and meaning and context.
Yeah, just start again.
There's a lot of danger translating between languages of context and meaning of words. Do you find these translations in Syriac show a different understanding or sort of subtext to what is being told in the Gospels, or is it much the same as we would expect it from the Greek sources or other languages?
Well, I'm tempted to ask Peter that. Do you want to answer that, Peter? And then will this be our last question?
Yes, I don't think it would be particularly different between two ancient languages and between two modern languages.
So Peter doesn't think there's much different. There were small inflections, idiomatic uses that perhaps weren't quite realized to be idiomatic uses, but when you had the Greek, the Syriac text to compare, then you could find it. But I think the manuscript they discovered was fairly old. It was not as old as the Codex Sinaiticus, but the transcription, the actual translation into Syriac it bore, was very old, and that did again push our understanding of the Syriac back. And it was the first to confirm, as you may know, in the ancient manuscripts, the Gospel of Mark has a shorter ending. There's no resurrection appearance in it. And there was always a debate as to whether the older manuscripts didn't have the resurrection appearances in Mark. And their manuscript did not have it, and in a way that confirmed that the earliest manuscripts didn't have the resurrection in Mark. But Agnes and Margaret, you might think, what, as very devout Presbyterians, what did they do with that? They said, well, it doesn't matter, because Paul was the first Christian writer, and he's all about the resurrection. So they were fairly resilient in their very, nonetheless, very committed way. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.